Ágætu ráðstefnugestir, hjartanlega velkomin til þessara samveru hér í Hátíðasal Háskóla Íslands sem ber yfirskriftina Listin að deyja. Við sem höfum unnið að undirbúningnum í vetur eigum það sameiginlegt flest að hafa starfað í nálægð dauðans inn á stofnunum í mörg ár. Þar höfum við fundið þörfina fyrir samtalið dauðan sem verður oft svo erfitt á þeim stundum. Okkur og skjólstæðingum okkar skortir orðin, áræðið og kjarkinn. Samfélag okkar býður ekki upp á þetta samtal svona yfirleitt. Mikilvægi þessa orða það sem erfitt getur leitt til innihaldsríks tíma fyrir fjölskyldur, losað streituna sem eðlilega fylgir í þessum aðstæðum. Við eigum margar klisjur sem notaðar í þessum aðstæðum eins og þetta jú leiðin okkar allra eða allavega allra hinna. Eitt sinn verða allir menn að deyja og svo framvegis. En hvaða hugsanir eru þar á baki? En von okkar að í dag getum við sem hér erum átt innihaldsríka samveru þar sem við fræðumst, spyrjum spurninga og ræðum saman. Von okkar að við getum haldið áfram að ræða dauðan meðan við enn erum í standi til þess, getum miðlað áfram reynslu og að þessi ráðstefna sé upphaf af einhverju sem nýtist okkur öllum. Dr. Fenwick, thank you very much for being here with us today. We look forward to hear about your researches and your studies in near-death experience. We hope that you have the opportunity to see and enjoy something in our country while you stay. And I am sure that yesterday was a good day for you and your family. I wish you all the best and again thank you for coming. Ágætu gestir, áður en ég segi ráðstefnuna Listin að deyja setta og býð Ævar Kjartansson að gjöra svo vel að taka við fundarstjórn, vil ég koma á framfæri þakklæti okkar í undirbúningsnefndinni til Ingunnar Gísladóttur sem rekur gistiheimili Bröttugötu 3 í Grjótaþorpinu en hún studdi verkefnið með því að hýsa Dr. Fenwick og fjölskyldu hans. Þá ætla ég að bjóða þér að koma og taka við Ævar, gjörðu svo vel. Takk fyrir og vona við njótum samverunar. Takk.
Heiður að samkoma. Það mér heiður að fá að hjálpa til við þessa samverustund og ég verð að segja að ég satt að segja svolítið hissa á því hversu margir eru mættir. Það ekki bara þessi salur hér, hátíðasalur háskólans, heldur eru kennslustofur hér einnig fullar af fólki. Það út af fyrir sig sýnir að það ákveðin þörf fyrir umræðu dauðan. Yfirskriftin listin að deyja og finnst kannski einhverjum skrítið, en það kannski skýrist þegar lengra verður haldið. Okkur býða hér verkefni býsna mikil og tímafrek. Við hlustum hér á erindi Fenwicks. Við heyrum kynningu á vef sem heitir ævi.is og síðan verður gott fólk saman komið hér á þessum palli í pallborðsumræður og hugsunin svo hjá okkur og skipuleggjendum að þessu verði lokið ekki seinna en 7:30. Ég vil benda ykkur á að loknu erindi Peters Fenwicks þá gefst tækifæri til þess að leggja nokkrar spurningar fyrir hann. Tímans vegna verða menn og biðja ykkur það strax að afmarka þær mjög vel, hafa þær mjög klárar og kvittar og þær verða að vera á ensku. Það eru hljóðnemar hérna sem verður komið með til þeirra sem vilja leggja spurningar fyrir Peter Fenwick. Bara til þess að segja deila á honum í örfáum orðum. Hann mjög þekktur fræðimaður á þessu sviði. Hann prófessor emeritus við King's College í Lundúnum og hann mjög afkastamikill rannsakandi og rithöfundur. Hann hefur skrifað mikið rannsóknir sem hann hefur gert víða. Hann hefur upp á síðkastið rannsakað fólk eða reynslu fólks bæði í Bretlandi og Hollandi. Nú, nýjasta afurð á ritvellinum bók sem hann og konans Elisabeth sem þau hafa skrifað og heitir einmitt The Art of Dying. Þannig að titill ráðstefnunar hann má segja sóttur þangað og erindi hans hér í dag heitir The Importance of End-of-Life Experiences for Living and Dying. Þannig að það ekki eftir neina bíða. Professor Fenwick, I'm honored to welcome you to the rostrum here at the University of Iceland. Please.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you particularly for inviting me here today. I was extremely lucky with the weather yesterday, and thank you for arranging that as well. And so we had a wonderful tour, the Golden Circle, and it was absolutely perfect. And it struck me that Iceland is very like Scotland. But then it should be. But I was also born in Africa, and if you just take the snow away, the wilderness and the barrenness of Iceland is very like that of Africa as well. So in a way, I feel I'm coming home. So let me first of all thank the following organizations that helped to bring me here. There were 9 of them, and they all came together, and they were instrumental in asking me to come. So thank you all very much for that. So then, I have a question, and I think you might also be interested in how this all started. How did it start? Well, let me tell you what happened when I sent a letter about the experiences of dying to a famous London paper. It was an article, and I thought they might like to write it, to print it. And when I rang the editor 2 months later, because nothing had happened, he said this: "You see, we don't do dying. It's so depressing." Believe you me, they all do dying, whether they like it or not. But so they finally agreed that maybe 1 article every 6 months was what it was about. This was way back in the year 2000, but I think things have changed a little bit. So few of us are prepared to look closely at death. Why? And that is our question. This goes very much to Freud's paradox. He noticed that when discussing death, we're happy to talk about other people's, but never our own. And if you go to a party or talk to your mates, you can say, "Did so-and-so die?" "Yeah," but you never said, "Well, you see, I'm going to die soon. And I'm going to make all these arrangements," and etc. We don't do that. And that's called Freud's paradox. We sweep death under the carpet. But was it always like this? No, it wasn't, in fact. I've got a picture here of the death of Napoleon, an engraving, and if you look at it, you will see that, in fact, there are children. Do you see? The child there, another child there. So they were all there. And also, in Victorian times, of course, death was terribly common. You couldn't avoid it. So all the family were at the deathbed. And what has happened since then is that slowly it has, in fact, altered so that you can't, it gets swept away. This is how we die in the 21st century. Is that what you want? If you really like that? Well, whether you'd like it or not, it's going to happen to many of you. unless we start understanding what death is about and make the proper arrangements for it. So then, contemporary Western attitudes towards death: death is medicalized and banished from the home. Death is not natural. Instead, it's a medical failure. It is offensive and should occur in private. Daily life is unmarked by death. And death is an embarrassment. Often the dying and bereaved are isolated. Any of you had a friend who's died, and when you see them walking along the pavement to you, towards you, you just think, well, maybe I don't know how to approach this person. Well, it's just because we're very, very unfamiliar with death. So let me ask you all a question. Do you know what is going to happen as you die? And you're all going to die, I'm afraid. No map? You don't have a map? Would you go into a jungle like that without a map? No. Would you go into the Icelandic highlands without a map? No. Because you come across things like that, not in Iceland, obviously. But you need a map, you need where you're going, and this is going to be one of the most important experiences, no, the most important experiences of your life, but yet you won't enter into it with a map. The current situation is that 30% of Britons fear dying alone. I mean, it's terrible, that. 56% of us will die in NHS hospitals, National Health Service hospitals. NHS spending on the dying is minimal, and in National Health Service hospitals, more than 50%, more than half the complaints refer to care of the dying. Is this because our nurses aren't compassionate? No, it's not. It's because the hospitals are not set up to look after the dying. They're set up to look after people who are ill and getting better, but not the dying. It requires a totally different set of skills. But fortunately, this is now being looked after in better ways. Does ignoring death have consequences for us? You might think about that. How many of you rolled up your night clothes, put them in a corner of your sleeping cell, and went out expecting to die that day? None of us. Because you see, we are immortal, aren't we? And so the Dalai Lama points out that we suffer from a false sense of permanence. No, of course we're not going to die. We become more greedy, more self-serving and lustful, have more enemies. Try and have an enemy in the last few months of your life. There's no point. You can't do it. So if you realized that you weren't permanent, you'd have fewer enemies. And you become attached to things. You become attached to my wealth, my health, my friends, my enemies, and my family. So it actually does matter for our society if we reject death in the way that we do. We know that death is the shutting down of the body and brain, but we know little about the dying process and the mental states of the dying. Now I'm going to talk to you about the mental states of the dying. On the one hand, you have the physical processes. We now, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure you do in Iceland as well, have very good pain control of people as they move towards death. You also will have very good physical services there as well. But how many of you know about the mental states of the dying? Mental states means what the dying experience. Have we actually done that? Well, no, we haven't. And you see, it's important because we want to know, is death the end of consciousness or the beginning of a journey? The best place to find out is from the dying themselves. So why don't we look at the evidence to see if we can get some idea of those two questions? The first scientific study of deathbed visions was Sir William Barrett. He was a British researcher, And he began to collect stories of deathbed visions when he heard of a patient who, while dying, saw a vision of her sister, Vida, to whom she had been close, but who had not been told about her sister's recent death. So it's interesting. His book, Deathbed Visions, published in 1926, was the first scientific study to conclude that these experiences were not just a byproduct of a dying brain, but could occur when the dying patient was lucid and rational. So his stories are really interesting, and I would recommend that you get hold of his book, which has just been published by White Crow. And you'll see that the stories that people told to William Barrett are very similar to the ones which, the stories which are being told as well. So we must ask the question, why is end-of-life experience research important? In our culture, we fear death and shut it out by not discussing it. So one of the first things, clearly, is to discuss it. We do not understand and have not studied the subjective process of dying. There are very few studies of phenomena at the time of death. There is uncertainty about whether such phenomena are spiritual or organic in origin. Is it just the closing down of the body, or does it point towards transcendence in any way? Many carers feel they lack training in how to respond when told about these phenomena. So we set out to find some answers, and we studied carers of the dying. Now, why did we study carers of the dying? Why not study the dying themselves? And that was because I started this study in 2002, and the ethics committee were frightened that if you talked to the dying, you would upset them. Things have moved on now, and they found out that dying are people, and some of them actually like to talk. But then there was this medical reticence about involving dying people. So I said, okay, we'll do a carer study. And so our data that we collected was on carers of the dying. It was a 5-year retrospective, that means the past 5 years, and a 1-year prospective study, and I'll explain that a bit more. It was in England, Holland, and Ireland. We looked at 1 palliative care team, 2 English and 3 Dutch hospices, and 1 nursing home, and the 1 Irish study was carried out by Dr. Una McColville. Now, when people heard that I was doing a study like this, members of the general public sent in emails. We have in well over 1,000 emails now of stories. So we're very data rich concerning what actually happens when people die. My colleagues are Sue Brain, Hilary Lovelace, Inika Kodam, and Dr. Una McColville. So the first question that I had to ask was, do end-of-life experiences occur? And why did I have to do that? And that's because the actual literature is very poor. And there were very, very few studies. In fact, you could, if you wanted to, become an international expert in 1 day. There were so few studies to read. Fortunately, it is changing now. Now, the present consensus is that about 80% of those dying consciously will have an end-of-life experience. So the first thing that you gain from that is that you must learn about these things, because it's going to be a map for 80% of you who die consciously. So these are now coming right into the foreground from being just not studied as interesting in the earlier days. I'm going to talk to you about the death process. That is, the few weeks coming up to death. Then what happens at the time of death. And we'll talk about the dissolution of consciousness. So before death, we'll talk about the phenomena then. Actually at the moment of death. And then around and after death. Death is not a boring process, either for the person who's dying or for those around. It is, in fact, really interesting, and we need to know more about it. So how can it start? It starts with premonitions. Now, these are rare. We have some of these in our stories. Premonition is a warning before you're given the terminal diagnosis that you're going to die. So if you like, it's a pre-warning. Now, there's a long history of this in folklore. You have your own one in Ireland, knowing that if you go into battle and you see the Valkyries riding by, that means you'll probably die. Ravens circling over a cottage is very common in England. And there are, in the olden days when we had small cottages in the country, if you heard the yapping of hounds, it meant that there was likely to be a death. So there are premonitions then in our culture. Now, this is one of the recent ones that I've got. A mother told me this story about her daughter's husband. He was 25 and the couple had 2 young children, but he seemed to be preparing for death. He wrote his will, got his affairs in order, and said that his work was complete. It's a rather unusual story, but interesting. And it was now time for him to die. Now, as a psychiatrist, I'd know exactly what this was. He was depressed and was going to commit suicide. That's absolutely not true. He was functioning perfectly normally. And in fact, one day his firm sent him on a trip abroad, and the plane he was in crashed and he was killed. So he had a clear premonition about his death. You can also get premonitions of other people's death. And this is one about the death of her daughter. I woke up in the morning totally upset over my daughter's death. I was so surprised and confused to see her lying next to me that I nudged her to see if she was alive. She had apparently gotten up during the night and climbed in next to me. When she moved, I cried uncontrollably with relief that she was not dead. She did not make any fuss. Perhaps she knew why I felt relief. I did not tell her I had thought she was dead. I could not remember any dream, but the feelings were so strong and real, exactly as they were 2 days later when she was the victim of a hit-and-run accident. So that's another premonition. So I say they are not common, but they certainly occur. So I think it's right that we should begin there with premonitions. Now, the next important phenomena that we come across are deathbed visions. And these are the ones that I talked to you about with Sir William Barrett. Let me just give you some examples so that you get a feel for it. When I was working as a district nurse, I used to visit an 80-year-old lady once a week. She eventually became weaker and was semi-conscious. The day after she died, her daughter said that she was lying peacefully and suddenly sat bolt upright with a beaming smile on her face and said, "Joe, how nice of you to come to see me." Joe was her deceased husband. She lay down again and died soon after. The daughter was very sensible and practical and really believed that her father had visited. So there is clear features in it. First of all, the people who get the visit aren't upset by it. And secondly, they're usually either a parent or family friends. Here's one where old friends came. We were sitting with him talking quietly. He was too ill to contribute much, but liked to hear us chatting. Suddenly, he leaned forward and stared across the room. Became very happy and animated. Note, how many of you would be happy and animated if you saw one of your dead relatives? Particularly after this talk, you certainly wouldn't. But nevertheless, they are. He became very happy and animated and began to talk to people he could obviously see, but we couldn't. He called them each by name, asking them how they were and how wonderful it was to see them again. It became apparent that they were men who had served with him at the Somme and died there. There was a look of wonderment on his face, and he forgot his pain. And then later, he died. And sometimes it's certainly quite unexpected. And here's one. A couple of days before my father's death, my grandmother died suddenly. And this is really what set off Sir William Barrett on his studies, because he recognized that they couldn't be due to expectation because of cases like this. A couple of days before my father's death, my grandmother died suddenly, but we did not tell my father, as we did not want to upset him. And as he was passing away, he turned to my mother and said, "Your mum is here. What on earth is she doing here?" He then smiled and died. So you can't claim expectation. This is something where the dead appeared in the deathbed vision. I think the fact that my father could not possibly have known that his mother-in-law was dead makes this experience all the more interesting. And he says, and to my mind, convincing of an afterlife. But it's really interesting. So we can't always use expectation. Now, we've done 3 studies on this. They're all much the same. So I'll show you this one, which is one where we looked at 118 visions, and we asked various questions. The first question we asked was, who do the dying see in their deathbed visions? And here it's very clear. About 24% saw their parents, persons unknown, greeting people joyfully with no speech, because as you become very weak, you stop speaking, and then you can greet people by smiling and holding up your hand, other relatives. But I want you to notice that in our culture, only about 3% of us see angels, and 3% of us see friends. And you'll be sad to hear that very, very few of us see pets. So you're not going to be met by your dog or your cat. It's going to be your mother. There you are. I thought it was going to be my mum. Okay, so who sees them? The dying. Very rarely others in the room, especially children. And very, very rarely hospice or hospital staff. So they're seen by other people. So that's why I don't call them hallucinations. That's why I call them apparitions, because hallucinations are seen only by one person. These sometimes are seen by more. How do they come? Often they come into the room shortly before death, will stand around or sit on the deathbed in the room, but appear to be in real space as the dying direct their gaze and comment at a particular place. Maybe more than one person, and occasionally unknown people wait at a distance and come closer as death approaches. Now, there is in fact a sort of metric to this, and the idea of approach, slowly approaching the deathbed, is important. So then, why do they come? The dying are very clear about that. They come to greet the dying person, to reassure them they will be with them, to tell them when it's time to go, to take them on a journey. And indeed, these factors are enormously important for the dying person, because their language changes. As soon as you've had your deathbed visitor, you start saying, when I leave here, when I go on a journey, when I move on, etc. You change in your attitude to what's going to happen. But note, they can be negotiated with, and the time of death delayed for a short while. It's no good saying that I don't want to die because there's a hospice party, but you can say important things to you, like my son is coming from America, and I don't want to die before he arrives. Here's somebody who's trying delaying tactics. My sister heard Dad talking very crossly to someone in his room. Fearing that one of her children had gone in and upset him, she went in to see what was going on. only Dad was in his bed. My sister asked him who he was talking to. He replied, "I was telling the angels that I was not ready to go yet." He knew I was coming and was determined to stay alive until I had seen him. So clearly, in fact, her negotiation was successful. So remember that. If you have a deathbed visitor who says they're coming back on Tuesday and it's important for you to stay alive until Thursday, chat to them about it. Choosing when to go. He's refusing to die as a protest against inheritance tax. Might work for a bit, but not for long. Okay, so we've got premonitions, and now we've got deathbed visions, with the joy that they bring to the dying, the hope they give the dying, and the information that they give the dying. So, is there a cultural component to this? Well, yes, there is. And if you look, this study comes from Osis and Haraldson in 1977. And if you look at the top one here, you see religious figures in America are, in fact, about 10%. But if you go to India, they're about 50%. And the rest, these are apparitions of the dead, so these are deathbed visions. And the blue sector is, in fact, visions or dreams of other people. Now, we want to know what this is due to. And there has been, and I'm pleased about this, a discussion in the literature. The first thing is, are they hallucinations? Are they organic hallucinations? That means, are they confusional? Well, one thing about it is they're not confusional. There's a very nice paper here which looks at the various factors, and there are, in fact, many differences between deathbed visions and ordinary hallucinations. So I think we can take it, if you really look at the evidence in detail, that they're not just simply hallucinations, confusional hallucinations. They're not due to the organic processes which go on during death. They're not due to drugs. They seem to stand right apart from that. So that's deathbed visions. And then you come to another fascinating piece of experience that many of the dying have. When I first did this study, I called it moving to new realities. And it's the sort of thing is this. You're in the hospice, and then you move out, in your mind, of course, into a transcendent reality, another world. Then you're back in the hospice again. The other world seems enormously real, and it is transcendent, and it is beautiful. And here's an example of it. Suddenly she stared intensely up at the window. This is the mum who's dying in the hospice. This lasted only minutes, but it seemed ages. She suddenly turned to me and said, "Please, Pauline, don't ever be afraid of dying. I've seen a beautiful light, and I was going towards it. I wanted to go into that light. It was so peaceful, I really had to fight to come back." Sadly, she died the next morning, but I knew she had seen something that day that gave her comfort and peace when she knows she only had hours to live. Now, this is a totally fascinating phenomenon, and there has been a study from Switzerland just published in which they took 240 cases of people dying from cancer, and they asked them in the last fortnight of their life about these transcendent experiences. And they found that over 60% had transcendent experiences, but they thought, in fact, that more dying people had them. So you have to now accept that transcendent experiences are, in fact, relatively common in the dying. And what is it like? Well, here's another one. This is one from Italy. The gauze over his face moved. I ran to him. Adriana, my dear, your mother, who had died 3 years before, is helping me to break out of this disgusting body. There is so much light here, so much peace. Light, peace, love and compassion, meeting of dead relatives and spiritual beings is what the dying report in this period when they're going into this new reality. So it's important to know where you're going. This, in fact, is somebody who believes that when death comes, you're switched off like this. And this is her account. So she has no belief in anything. It's all coming to an end here, now. I was nursing my friend who had definite views that there was no afterlife. In her last couple of hours, she became very peaceful and arose from her unconsciousness periodically, saying clearly and happily such phrases as, I will know soon, come on, get on with it then, I'm ready to go now, and it's so beautiful. She'd immediately lapse back into unconsciousness after uttering these phrases. She was very obviously content, happy, and at peace. It was a wonderful experience for her partner and me. So you don't have to have any belief system. The experiences you get guide you through the dying process. So what is this new reality like? It's very much like the near-death experience world, which most of you know. Light, love and compassion, wholeness and feelings of unity. They describe a waiting area with spiritual beings and dead relatives are present. So that it has a definite structure. And you may be interested in this paper, which was published in 2013 in Switzerland. So we can put new reality into our picture. So around the time of death, many events occur. And I want to stress, I'll just tell you what they are and then we'll start with them. You get deathbed coincidences, which I'll explain, clock stopping, animals being emotionally disturbed, bells going off, lights and shapes seen leaving the body. So we're going to look at this. And again, I was trying to point out to you that death is not just a switching off. There are a whole set of phenomena. We don't yet in science understand what consciousness is, but certainly when consciousness leaves the body, it seems as if other things happen as well. So deathbed coincidences, what are they? This is a visit initiated by the dying person, and we've got very good evidence of that at the moment of death, to someone of great emotional significance to him or her. In other words, sometimes your son doesn't make it, and then it seems that some people have the opportunity to go and see him and give him a message. And distance is no barrier. Now they're called deathbed coincidences, and they work like this. Here you are in Canada, and here's your son in the UK, and you're dying in Canada. And then this connection between the two of you is established. Now this is enormously interesting because it has, again, definite characteristics. It depends on whether you're awake when you get the message or asleep. So the person dies, contacts the other one. If they're awake, they have one form. If you're asleep, they have another. Here's an awake one. One morning around 1950, my father and I had to visit a distant relative, Kate, to tell her that her brother had died the previous day. You can think of Iceland, somebody in a remote part of Iceland. In those days, no television, no telephone, and no way of knowing. She lived in a remoter part of Easter Ross and was not on the telephone. When Dad and I arrived at the farmhouse, we were met by Kate, who said, "I know why you've come." I heard him calling me, saying, "Kate, Kate," as he passed over. She was quite matter-of-fact about it and gave us the time of death, which was exactly the same as that recorded by the hospital. I found it an amazing experience, but have never forgotten it, nor will I ever. I was about 17 at the time, and she was quite elderly when she told this story. So she, in fact, heard her name being called by her father as he died. Here's another one when somebody's asleep. Now, the form of the visit here is quite different. It's quite often is a narrative dream. Narrative means it tells a story. I drifted back to sleep and had the most vivid dream where my 22-year-old son was talking to me. He was telling me that he was dead, but that I was not to worry or be upset because he was all right. Do you see the clear message that she's being given by him? When I woke, I was very disturbed and tried to contact my son. I found out later that day that he'd been drowned the previous night. I'm convinced that he did contact me. And then please note the next sentence. I've drawn great comfort from his visit to me over the years. They're very comforting, these deathbed coincidences. Now, the important part of that story is that when we talked to her, she saw her son come to him like this in the dream. He was dripping wet, and as he came towards her, he seemed to come into the light. He transfigured himself in a transpersonal way, gave her the message, "I'm okay, Mum," and then disappeared. So that they have a very complex structure to them, which is really interesting. Okay, so what's the relationship to the dying person? 80% of first-degree relatives of the dying person, and granddaughters and grandmothers, are quite common. So it's either going to be your mum, sorry about that, or your dad, or it may be your grandmother, depends. So how do we know that we can be sure they're not coincidences? Because you say, look, people are dying all the time. You're going to get a message from somebody, aren't you? And so it's just a coincidence. That's why they're called deathbed coincidences. But when you look at them, you can see they're not. Because 93% were verified as occurring at the time of death. So, first of all, they're not random. They occur at the time of death. And then the next thing is that death was unexpected in half the cases in our study and expected in only a third. So you can't say that they knew they were going to die, that's why they had the dream. It's not actually like that. Most people don't. So it occurs at the time of death to people who may be totally unprepared to get one. So what are the effects of the coincidences? They are as important to the relatives of the dying and as comforting for the relatives of the dying as deathbed visions are for the dying. They're very comforting experiences. So one of the nice things to do would be to teach people about this, and certainly if they get one, they'll understand it. Now, also at death, clocks stop, animals respond emotionally, again at the time of death, machines malfunction, light surrounds the body, and shapes seen leaving the body. These all sound strange to you, but they sound strange to you because you don't understand what the importance of death is and the change in consciousness which occurs. It has physical effects. Let me talk about shapes seen leaving the body. As my father, died, something which is very hard to describe because it was so unexpected and because I'd seen nothing like it, left up through his body and out of his head. It resembled distinct, delicate, wavy lines of smoke. Smoke is not the right word, but I've not got a comparison, and then disappeared. I was the only one to see it. It left me with such a sense of peace and comfort. Now, these shapes leaving the body are, in fact, seen by a good proportion of people, and they had taken on different forms, which we don't have time to go into today. But if any of you are interested in this and if you look up the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there's a similarity to what they report and what we're actually finding in our studies. Now I want to go on to the next one, which is light at the time of death. I'm totally fascinated by light. Why should there be light in the room of the dying? Sometimes it's so bright that it shines into the corridor, and I certainly didn't understand it and still don't. This is light at death is seen by onlookers, parallels in some respects what the dying say when they see into their new reality. It's got that light, and if you walk into the light, then it's comforting and loving, just like that, the near-death experience. It's as if the dying person is being enfolded in light. Here are a couple of examples, not of the very wide ones, but of the simpler ones. Sometimes I've seen a light. It's from a hospice chaplain. Sometimes I've seen a light which is in a corner, like candlelight. It's a golden light. It's not electric light, and it's not one of the hospice lights. It just appears sometimes. And it goes when they die. They take their last breath, and as everything settles down, the light goes out. Well, what's our understanding of that? Here's another one. When my mother was dying, this amazing light appeared in the room. The whole room was filled with this amazing light, and her mother died. There are certain things about the light which to me are interesting, and that is that not everybody in the room will see it. And in fact, sometimes a brother and a sister won't see it, whereas others do. So it's got interesting characteristics to it which we need to understand. Suddenly I was aware that her dead father was stood at the foot of her bed, so deathbed vision. My mother was staring at him too, and her face was lit up with joy. Well, that could be just a figure of speech. It was then that I saw her face appeared to be glowing with a gold light. The light began to leave to the top of her head and go up towards the ceiling. Looking back to my mother's face, I saw that she was no longer breathing. So again, it's a transformation of the individual by the light as they die. Now, let's come on to something else which interests me. These are clocks. You have long case clocks in Iceland, don't you? You know, the ones, the big pendulums. But you don't have in Iceland the story, or the song actually, was written by an American after a visit to England. My grandfather's clock stopped dead, never to go again. I won't try and sing it to you. But it's well known in the UK, and so the idea of the clock stop at the time of death, we're quite familiar with. Now, obviously, I'd heard this, but people have sent me a lot of clock stories. Now, I had one question, actually a lot of questions, but one question was, now that we've moved into this modern era, what about all these electronic clocks? Do they stop like pendulum clocks used to, or is something different? So here's one which I think points towards the answer. My father died at 3:15 a.m. When I went to tell my uncle Archie, who'd been close to Dad, it was clear when he opened the door that he was distressed. And as I began to tell him, he interrupted me and said he already knew. He said no one had telephoned him, but told me to look at the clock on the mantelpiece. It was stopped at 3:15. As was indeed his own wristwatch, his bedside clock, and all other clocks in the house. There was even an LED display, I think, on the radio, flashing 3:15. So there you are. I was completely taken aback, but Archie seemed comfortable with the phenomenon and was just concerned at losing someone close. So clearly, clocks do stop, and even the modern electronic clocks stop. The other thing that you get are abnormalities, mechanical abnormalities. Alarms go off in the room of the nurses, and televisions stop. So there are changes like this. And this one, the picture I got obviously from Google, Mystic Moggs comes from the Daily Mail after they serialized a chapter in our book. And it was Cats and Death were published in the New England Journal of Medicine, the highest impact factor journal in America. And that one was Oscar the cat. And Oscar the cat was always found sleeping on the bed of the next person who was going to die. And so we looked through our emails, and there are 4 hospices in England that have cats like Oscar, and here's one. My dad was never particularly fond of cats, but in the hospice there was a cat there named Peter, and even Dad welcomed Peter onto his bed. Mum noticed the cat paid particular attention to some patients who seemed then to be the next to die. Mentioning this to a nurse, she was told that he did indeed do this, and when they had more than one very ill patient, they tended to know who would be first, as that would be where Peter was spending his time. A couple of staff denied the link, but most just gave a knowing smile and said simply, "Oh, you've noticed then." So yes, cats do seem to have a special relationship. One of the letters to the New England Journal of Medicine said, "I wonder what viruses cats carry," so that people die when they're on their bed, but that was just humorous. Okay, so let's summarize what I've said so far using the death data. You can see that we started with premonitions, deathbed visions, going to a new reality, deathbed coincidences, clocks, animals, bells, lights, and shapes seen leaving the body. So dying is not simple, it's complex, and it has enormous consequences for our scientific understanding of what death is. And the whole thing goes with the loosening of consciousness, and that seems to be the process of death. So the conclusion of our studies, and I'm pleased to say that these conclusions have been backed up by other studies, is that end-of-life experiences are not uncommon. Indeed, 80% can hardly be called uncommon. But it's 80% of those people dying consciously. There's a spiritual language of the dying. Patients are frightened to talk about them, in case they're thought mad. Carers seldom discussed end-of-life experiences between themselves. This was so when we first went into the hospices in the UK, but it's less so now. And carers do not in the UK have training in this area and find it difficult to respond to patients who want to talk to them. So we asked the question, what is a good death? A good death simply means the person has died as he or she wanted. And do listen to this, because in the new era that I hope will come on when we take charge of our death process rather than just letting it happen, you can die as you want to. If you want to die at home, then set it up beforehand if you can. The opportunity to talk about fears they may have and about dying, if they've had end-of-life experiences, to have them validated, because quite often the carers didn't validate them. They said, no, it's nothing. The chance to settle unfinished business and say farewell, this is enormously important, because one of the most unsettling things when you're dying is having unfinished business, particularly with relatives, and the ability to choose the time to die, either alone or with the family present, and make up your own mind, because there comes a point in the dying process when you want to let go, but you don't want to do it in front of your wife. So know about this and decide exactly what you want. Reconciliation is in many respects what the dying process is about. And here's a nice example of it. My father and I had never got on, and I had left home at the age of 16 and never gone back. One day, on my way to work, I had a sudden need to head north for home. They had never gone back, and then he felt this compulsion within himself. When I arrived, Mum came rushing out in tears. My father was dying of cancer. They had not been able to get in touch with me. I made my peace with my dad, who said now he'd seen me, he was ready to go, and he died that night. It's a very touching story, but this is in fact, in many respects, what death can be about. It can be about reconciliation. Dying is a spiritual process, transcendence, over 60%, possibly going higher. The exit of consciousness is poorly understood, and the mental states of the dying have been neglected. This should have been taught to all our kids when they were younger. It's exactly what happens when they die. We teach them all about living, but they're all going to die, and they don't know. So in a nutshell, preparing for a good death. Teach people, including children, not to be afraid of dying. You see, they all know about it. Their hamsters die. A fox came into one of my daughter's family and bit the head off the favourite guinea pig of one of the children. You know, they come across dying, and grandparents die as well. Learn what may happen when you die. Prepare for death. Don't just clean up your attic, but clear up your relationships. Terribly important, this. And discuss death. Don't sweep it under the carpet. So very simple things which we can do. So don't be afraid. This is one of the reasons why you won't look at it. But once you start looking at the data and understanding it, in my view, you don't have to be afraid. We've written 3 travel guides for your last journey. You can get a map. End of Life Experiences, a guide for carers of the dying. This one we wrote after having had a brainstorming session with carers, and it's sent free to every hospice in the UK. It's funded by a charity, so if anybody wants them, they can have it. I'm afraid it's written in English and not in Icelandic. And this one was written by Sue Brain, who was one of my co-workers when her father was dying. And it's Nearing the End of Life, a guide for relatives and friends of the dying. So it's a very simple one. And this, again, was sent out, and it's been adopted by a number of palliative care trusts in the UK. And just recently, it's been adopted by the palliative care group in Montreal. And this is now up on their website. So if you want a copy of it, you can go to Montreal's website and get one. Or just simply send me an email and I'll send you one. We also wrote a book, The Art of Dying. I think probably I'd change the name now. It was called The Art of Dying after the Ars Moriendi, which was a book which was written in the UK at the time of the Great Plague, when there weren't enough people priests to go around, so it was to help you with the dying process. So that's why I did it. I think I would now call it The Hope of the Dying, because one of the things that learning about dying does, it converts it from this awful black hole into which you're going to fall into a hole where there's hope. This is what the dying say. It's not something which I say. And remember that many people have been there before and told us exactly what it's like at the moment of dying. The great inventor Edison, just hours before his death, emerged from coma, opened his eyes, looked upwards and said, "It is very beautiful over there, so why be afraid?" And this one is a more modern one, Steve Jobs. According to his sister, as he died, Steve looked into the middle distance and said in wonder, "Wow, wow, wow." So come on, guys. I think if you get the right map, it's encouraging. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Fenwick, for helping us not to be afraid of death.
Absolutely.